Professor Angela is a leading international researcher into dyslexia and other developmental disabilities, encompassing a range of theoretical and applied contributions to this field. Her approach is broad and interdisciplinary, ranging from child and cognitive development to educational screening and intervention, as well as development cognitive neuroscience. She is the Vice President of the British Dyslexia Association and also the former Chair and Director of the Centre for Child Research at the Swansea University, United Kingdom. In her presentation today, she will be revisiting the cerebellar hypothesis. So let us invite Professor Angela to share her thoughts with us. Please put our hands together to welcome her.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here again. So, today I want you to put the clock back, really, 30 years to when I started my research on dyslexia. So, I started at the age of 40 as a mature student because our son Matthew was diagnosed as dyslexic when he was just 5.5. So, I wanted to find out about dyslexia and change the world. And so, here I am. And I'm going to talk about some of the theories we developed across the way and how they've been used in assessment. So, we came up with our first hypothesis for my PhD, the automatisation deficit hypothesis. And unlike other researchers, we weren't looking just at the literacy, we were looking at dyslexia as a specific learning difficulty or specific learning disability. So, some general problem in learning. So, for some reason, difficult for people who are dyslexic to become expert in a task. And that's whether it's a cognitive task or a motor task. So, this was our automatisation deficit hypothesis in 1990, so nearly 30 years ago now. We said that dyslexic children have problems making skills automatic and need, therefore, to consciously compensate even for simple skills. I wanted to show that dyslexic children working harder, even though they didn't seem to achieve very much. They put in lots of effort, but they weren't successful. Like those videos we looked at this morning, those children who were so moving in their need for their teacher to understand how they actually processed. This was our first study of balance and dyslexia. It has some very interesting labels on it. Yeah, okay. So what we were doing, we asked our 13-year-olds to balance, and we measured how wobbly they were. So in blue, we have the controls, and in yellow, we have the dyslexics. Okay. Then we asked them to count, and we put the two tasks together. And when we put the tasks together, the dyslexic children, the control children were absolutely fine. It made no difference to their balance. But the dyslexic children were no longer able to balance. So we said that under optimal conditions, they were balancing as well as controls, but they weren't balancing automatically, unlike the controls. They had to put in extra effort, even for things that were nothing to do with the literacy. An automatisation problem, even for balance. So we went on to look at how dyslexic children learn. And we put together a simple hand press. You hear a flash, see a flash, press a button, and a foot press, where you hear a tone and you press a button with your foot. We matched them to start with, and there were no problems in the individual task for the dyslexics, but then we put them together. And we looked at their learning over 2,500 trials. And so here we have the hand in blue for the dyslexics in the first side on the left, thank you, and in black for the controls. And on the right side, we have in blue the foot for the dyslexics and the black for the controls. And what I want you to see here is they just look as if they're very much worse, don't they, the dyslexic group, very much slower to do it. But in fact, they have problems in initially blending the tasks together. They make more mistakes. They're slower at the end, they're slower at learning. Sorry. And they're slower on the hand than the controls were on the foot. So if you look at those two little red circles on the left and the right, the dyslexics were slower on the hand, which is the more practiced one, than the controls on the foot, which is a completely novel task. And the controls were 30% faster. So in terms of our initial questions about where the problems lay in learning, we were looking at the learning curve. So you start off slow, and then you gather up speed in the middle and come up nicely up that slope, and then you ease off and don't improve anymore. And so there were problems at the start, the middle, at the end, and in blending the skills. So it wasn't just in terms of the automaticity, but in terms of all of their learning. So here we have the cube root rule. This is a new one. The extra time needed for a dyslexic child to master a task is proportional to the cube root of the time a non-dyslexic child takes. So if it takes 8 trials normally, it takes 16 for a dyslexic, 27, it takes 3 times as long. If 1,000, it's 10 times as long. So it's problems at all stages in learning, more than automaticity. And that led us to look at the brain. And this is where people thought we were crazy, really, because we were looking at balance. We were called the heretics of dyslexia research. So rather than looking at the reading, we were studying the way that children did all sorts of different tasks. Here's the cerebellum. It's at the back of the brain here. It's 10 to 15% of the brain weight, 40% of the brain surface area, 50% of the brain's neurons. It's always known to be to do with dexterity and automaticity, but there was recent research in 1989 which said that two-way connections between the cerebellum and Broca's area, the language area in the red circle, made it possible to improve language dexterity. And that's a combination of motor and mental skills, which we thought just exactly encapsulated what you don't have if you're dyslexic. Okay. And here we've got the brain learning. Oops, no, we haven't got the brain. Maybe we have. No, we lost that one. Never mind. We looked at a PET study, and we were able to show a difference between the dyslexics and the controls in new learning, just based in the cerebellum. Okay. So we have converging explanations of causal explanations converging on the cerebellum. Neuroscience theory saying the cerebellum is linked to reading. Cognitive theory, behavioral data on balance and skills. Discriminant data, we looked at the muscle tone in dyslexic children and showed it was different from a generalized learning difficulty. From practitioners who said, yes, that just seems to me to capture what it is. And we had brain imaging and neuroanatomy data. And here at the side, we have a study, an autopsy of the brains, the dyslexic brains in the American Brain Bank. And we showed differences in these Purkinje cells, in the larger Purkinje cells in the dyslexic brains. So that came to a causal chain, how it all develops from birth to the age of 8 when it might be diagnosed. So a cerebellar impairment and also another links with the cortex leads to balance, which is not necessarily important for reading, but nevertheless is important for identifying children with problems. A motor skill impairment, which leads directly into writing, one of the criteria deficits in dyslexia. Articulation, which leads straight through to phonological awareness, and problems in automatizing skills and knowledge. So here we have what the Americans call a double whammy. So we have difficulty in learning and then difficulty in becoming automatic. And that all impacts on grapheme, phoneme conversion, word recognition, orthographic regularities, all those things that we associate with dyslexia. And that leads directly to reading difficulties and also to spelling difficulties. And we think the main route through here is through the cerebellum, through articulation, which is one of our most intense motor skills, which leads to problems in phonological awareness, and that impacts on working memory, which is so key to learning in dyslexia. Okay. And declarative learning, that's learning facts, should be spared. Here's our book at the bottom. So how do learning disabilities develop, and why is there so much comorbidity? We began to look at the procedural learning system. This is learning how to do things rather than learn the declarative, which is learning facts. And we think there are differences in the procedural learning system for both motor and language from birth. If you have just a motor problem, it leads to motor skill deficits. It also impacts on speech, and the language will also, of course, impact on speech and phonology. If you have a declarative learning difficulty, that gives you a more generalized learning difficulty, a less surprising problem. So motor skill leads directly into dyspraxia, speech into specific language impairment, and phonology into dyslexia, usually diagnosed when you're around 8. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that for any given child, the specific pattern of declarative and procedural difficulties and strengths are unique to that child. We do need to find the way the children learn best. Current educational tools tend to test attainment rather than potential, and there are very few for non-declarative learning. So we need to develop a series of tests for the different types of learning, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute, to the assessment component. And having done that, in principle, we need to be able to tailor the teaching to be able to support the child's abilities and disabilities. And so that will mirror established methods in many ways, but we have to take into account the brain and differences in brain function. Okay, I think I told you that for many years people thought we were crazy. Why would you look at the cerebellum? Everyone argued, no, it's nothing to do with the cerebellum, it's nothing to do with reading. So just last year, an important article came out from some American neuroscientists who took our theories and they reanalyzed them in the light of recent knowledge on the role of the cerebellum in all sorts of things, the links within the brain. And so they concluded that overall, multiple lines of research provide support for the cerebellar deficit hypothesis. This came out on my birthday. It was the best birthday present I've ever had. So they used both quantitative and qualitative evidence in a large meta-analysis to identify 3 regions which were linked to the right cerebellum, the area that we found was impaired. And that's one links the IPL links to phonology and working memory to the cerebellum. The IFJ links semantic memory, updating to the cerebellum, and the middle temporal gyrus, the MTG, links orthography, that's nonsense reading, to the cerebellum. And they concluded there was compelling evidence in support of automatisation deficit, cerebellar deficit, and procedural learning deficit. That was all of our theories. Hooray! So, it's all very well knowing the theoretical cause, but what are we going to do in practice? Well, in order to succeed in school, we need to be looking at executive function. Geeta talked about that this morning. Here we have the reading activities and sub-skills, which need to be in place between the ages of 3 and 6. So you have saying, seeing, writing, hearing, and underneath it all coordinating. And under that coordinating, we have the sensory motor cognitive circuits and the executive function circuits. And these are absolutely key to learning in the early years. So as we start to learn to read, we have speech and language developed, executive function developed, reading, developing into fluent reading beyond the age of 7. This is for normal readers. That's great. What about the dyslexics? Speech and language may not be as well prepared, executive function is not as good. And so when we start to teach them to read, they're not yet ready to learn. And the result is reading failure. So, classroom readiness is one of the key aspects that we're now focusing on in the UK and in America. Key areas of success in school relate to behaviour. Children start school with a range of differences in behaviour, ranging even from simple things like self-care and listening to language, ability to self-regulate, the capacity to organise themselves, to simply remember what they're asked to do, to cooperate, to follow instructions. These are all executive functions. You all know children who are completely off the wall. You can't actually get them to sit and listen. I'm sure as educational therapists, you've seen many, many of those children, particularly here at the DAS. Those all have to be in place before a child can even begin to start to deal with literacy. We need to ensure that children have the rudiments of learning before we can build on them. And this is particularly important for the children who are doubly disadvantaged. As Geeta was saying this morning, they are likely to be the ones who arrive in school less ready, less well equipped in language, less ready to listen and to sit down and cooperate. And so I want to talk here about two approaches to share. The DEST, the Dyslexia Early Screening Test, screening plus intervention, and a newly developed iPad, Assess for Success screening. Here's our Dyslexia Early Screening Test, well established now. We looked at early indicators of dyslexia. It's for children from 4.5 to 6. We start school, in fact, in the UK at 4.5. It's early literacy, letter names, phonological skills, rhyming, discrimination, working memory, things like digit span, cerebellar tests of balance, which is a new thing from us, motor skills, bead threading and shape copying, again, new components from our own theories, and rapid naming, speed of processing, the temporal processing associated with problems in dyslexia. And we have receptive vocabulary as well. And for the older children, we have measures of fluency as well as accuracy and literacy. So 1 minute reading and copying, nonsense passage, spelling, verbal and semantic fluency. And there are many screening programs, but not so many freely available intervention programs. And this was something developed in Wales, where I had held my chair, in response to the teachers' demands for something to do with those children that they identified as having problems. So the whole county were using our screening tests to identify children at 5 in their first term in school. And they identified the different components in our screening test and then created an intervention linked to this. So it has phonological awareness, auditory memory, visual memory, manual dexterity, gross motor skills. It's very concrete. It uses objects rather than pictures. It makes as many games as active as possible to make them appropriate for that age range. Uses textual feedback as far as possible, different media for similar activities, and it links the activities to class themes and projects. And here we have a first set of results for 12 hours intervention. So we have small group intervention, 20 minutes daily for a term. So that's an hour a week for 12 hours over a term, and that's at age 5. And here we have 670 children. And so in yellow, we have the first set is the pre-test. And here we have the high risk are in yellow and the low risk are in blue. So you could see there are large numbers of children in that set having difficulties. And then if we looked at the post-test, you could see that the results have dropped very nicely. Very few children with high risk and reduced numbers with low risk. So very substantial effects from just 12 hours of support. We carried on using it again in 2018. We had 306 children in that year. And here you can see in the first column we have mild risk, in the second column we have high risk, and in the third column we have no risk. And so what I want you to see is that the children from pre to post, the blue is the post, are moving very largely towards no risk. So we have 97% of schools in Pembroke using that. And in 48 of those schools, no children by year 1 were showing any sign of risk. So very, very effective. In fact, the school inspectors commented on how very useful it was. So a very exciting intervention, developed by the teachers, free in use, and available for anyone to use. If you want to send me an email, I could send you a copy, suitable for use anywhere in the world, in English, of course. But by this time, we were particularly focused on the importance of executive functions. And so we had developed a iPad assessment called Assess for Success. So executive functions like reasoning, working memory, and self-control can be improved. It's particularly good news because they're critical for school and job success and for mental and physical health. It's not just as children, it's as adults. It's the way to escape from that loop where you become one of the offenders, one of the people in prison. They need to be progressively challenged as children improve, and repeated practice is the key. The lovely thing here is that children put in time and effort to activities they love. That little boy this morning, if we'd given him something he could do and something he loved, he would have been motivated. Did you notice how well he drew? I noticed that. They should have been using the drawing to improve his skills, not focusing just on the things he couldn't do. So executive function interventions could use children's motivation to advantage. That will help them to improve. So you need to consider addressing children's emotional, social, and character development. And that's with a whole range of tasks. It's not just literacy. It's things like martial arts, yoga, curricula, all shown to improve executive function. And the nice thing here is that if you have really bad executive function, you've got scope for making the most improvement. So these are the kids who are going to really catch up, and it gives them the opportunity not to be left behind their peers. This is work from Adele Diamond in 2012. So here we have the Assess for Success, developed on the iPad. It's developed by myself and my colleague Rod Nicholson from Sheffield. And we have 7 tests. You could test between 5 and 10 children at once, more if you're working with older children. And you start off by taking the details of the user, and then for the younger children, the children under 7, you've got a test of naming, a test of inhibition. So you have to carry on with the naming, but this one, the first one, naming test, you name the cat, the dog, and the tree. Here, if you see Max, that little brown dog in the middle, you have to ignore him and do nothing. And that's quite difficult when you're 5 and 6. So then we have a test of memory span. It's picture memory. Then we have letter sounds. And that, in fact, is my little granddaughter, Evangeline, pronouncing the phonic sounds of the letters. Okay. Then we have hearing sounds, differentiating between the 2 sounds. And then we have the odd one out. The bell race, the odd one out is rhyming. The bell race is 2 tones that come close together, a high and a low, which one comes first. The copying we've now lost, and we've also lost the tapping. Okay. For the older children, we have many of the same tests. We also have a reading race, which is very innovative. We have a switcher, where you have to concentrate on either letters or numbers, digits or odd and even numbers. Breaking up words into sounds, the phonological awareness. Okay. Here we've got an example of the report. This is from a 12-year-old. And here we have, at the left-hand side, we've got the standard score, the individual scores in the first section, and green is average, orange is at risk, and red is severe risk. So, and in the bottom we have the factor scores. These are the factors underlying it. So the factor scores include things like speed, impulsivity, working memory, pre-literacy, reading, spelling, phonics, coordination of auditory and manual, coordination of auditory, and coordination of visual manual. And if you click on any of those ones that are at risk, it will show you the individual scores for each child, so you can see which areas they fell down on. Okay. And here we have a report. A lengthy report. It gives you all sorts of tips as a teacher for what sort of things you might do to help these kids. Because that's what we find, that people will say, oh, it's all very well telling me they've got these problems. What do I do now? Okay, so if they've got a speed problem, structured activities to improve speed. It does increase as you get older and as you become more mature and develop automaticity through practice. Practice games, such computer-based action games are great. Lots of things here. I don't have time to go through it all, but things like using a stopwatch. So you can either get faster at doing things, or you could spend longer doing things, whichever you need to do. Spelling, all sorts of things designed to help with spelling and phonics. Listening games to help improve that. Okay. And the next one. Okay, so what we're taking is a neuroconstructivist approach. We are trying to understand the dynamics of developmental trajectories. It affects both the genes and the environment. So we use early intervention for children, particularly those at genetic risk, to prevent the expression of the phenotype, change the trajectory, work with developing skills. We ensure children are ready to learn. We anticipate the progress from stage to stage with explicit input to develop language and executive skills. And we adopt an appropriate and different approach for preschool, primary and secondary children building on plasticity. At least a two-pronged attack. You prevent the development of procedural learning deficits, you build automaticity and remediate deficits which have already developed. But the key thing is to build in success, fun, and you raise self-esteem at all times. So what do you do for children who are failing? All sorts of things. For irregular English, we definitely need accuracy. We need phonics, as used at DEST and in the UK. There are phonics meta-analysis showed English and music training worked really well. Executive functions can be trained with action video games, unlikely as that seems. You can train non-linguistic components of speed with length, width, and varying exposures, extra-wide letter spacing, so I think we're using that at the moment, DS, and things like the reading fluency and movement pattern training used by Eleonora and Piero Crispiani. So, conclusions. There's growing evidence of impairments in learning for dyslexic children across the age range. There is now proof that cerebellar difficulties are linked to phonology and orthography. And those impairments are in place before children even reach school, in learning, in language, and in vision. To reduce those, we need to screen for strengths and weaknesses and provide consistent conditions for learning with explicit feedback, constant mapping before children fail. We need to focus on executive skills. And that's the way to get out of that cycle of failure. For older children, there's a range of approaches, harnessing new technologies, building on strengths and positive outcomes, and to express their full potential. There's much to be done, and we can all contribute. Thank you very much.